Good afternoon. Good afternoon. That was sloppy, kids. Good afternoon. All right. Welcome to Lunch with Books. My name is Sean. I'll be your host. If you have a cell phone, if you would silence it at this time, we would be most obliged. Next week, on the 23rd, Jessica Whitehead, who is from Wheeling, but now lives in Kentucky, she'll be back. Her book is called Driftwood, and it's about the artist, writer, and sustainability pioneer Harlan Hubbard. That'll be next week at noon. And on the 30th, we will screen the documentary Beacon Light, which is about OVGH, OVMC. Mary McKinley and Betty Jo Sproul will be here to sort of introduce the film, which is a little over an hour long. Thursday, October 2nd, Thursday, note, a special program for National Hispanic Heritage Month. Jackie Lozano of the ACLU West Virginia will be here to tell us about immigration to our great state. Our presenter today is Matthew Bunner. He is Vice President, Senior Structural Engineer, and Project Manager at HDR. He holds BS and MS degrees in Civil Structural Engineering from Lehigh University and currently serves as the Section Manager for Structures for HDR's West Virginia operations. He has over 34 years of experience, all with HDR, in the design and rehabilitation of various types of bridge structures. He's here to tell us about our two bridges, two of our most favorite bridges. Favoritist? No. Please welcome Matthew Bunner.
Thank you, Sean, and I appreciate all of you being here for your lunchtime. Even though I'm not a book, I'm happy to be here and talk to you about two of the famous bridges here in the area, the Monument Place and Wheeling Suspension Bridge, and the rehabilitation that's gone on over the last few years with those structures. Sean sort of stole my thunder and read everything that was on my slide, so I won't go over that again. But I have gone past 34 years. I'm 35 years now. Can't hear? Is that better? Okay. All right. Normally, my kids would say I don't have a problem projecting, but I'll get a little bit closer. I've gone past 35 years now, and I've worked my entire career here in the state of West Virginia for HDR Engineering. These are some pictures of some of the bridges that I've been lucky to be involved with over the years here in the state. And they were all very interesting projects, but none so more than the two projects that we'll talk about today. So the first part of my talk is about the rehab of the Monument Place Bridge. Constructed in 1817, it's the oldest bridge in the state and was placed on the National Historic Register in 1981. So this is a brief outline of this portion of the talk. And I just want to mention that the West Virginia Division of Highways is the owner of both of these structures that we're going to talk about today. So I doubt anyone here isn't aware of where Elm Grove is, but sometimes we forget that this part of, that the Northern Panhandle was actually a part of Virginia at the time of construction of this bridge in 1817. So in 1806, Congress and President Thomas Jefferson authorized construction of a national road to increase commerce and expansion to the west. So the first portion, which terminated here in Wheeling, was known as the Cumberland Road. And you can see here in red that it stretched from down in Maryland up to Wheeling, with the thought of extending it beyond that out to the west after they figured out a way to get across the Ohio River. So at this time, Henry Clay was the Speaker of the House of Representatives. And Clay had a friend named Moses Shepherd, and Moses Shepherd happened to receive the contract to build the road in Virginia, including the necessary bridges. So later, the national road became US Route 40, and Route 40 now generally parallels Interstate 70 through the Panhandle. The Monument Place Bridge is shown here in yellow, where it crosses Little Wheeling Creek. So it's interesting that at the time when the road was built, there were actually two bridges that were constructed around the same time, the Monument Place Bridge and what was known as the S Bridge in Triadelphia, also crossing Little Wheeling Creek. So you might ask yourself, why would they cross the creek twice when maybe they could have taken a more direct route and reached the same place? Well, the answer is that Moses' wife, Lydia, really wanted the road to go past her house. And apparently Moses was a smart man. So the national road crossed Little Wheeling Creek twice. Now, the S Bridge was demolished years ago, but Monument Place Bridge remained. So these are just two photos of the original configuration of the bridge. On the left, the photos from the late 1800s, and on the right, the photos from the flood of the Ohio River in 1907. These photos were graciously donated to me to use by the Ohio County Public Library, and I appreciate that. So in the 1930s, cantilever concrete sidewalks and barriers were added to the bridge. And then in the 1950s, the masonry was covered with reinforced shotcrete. Okay, so it looked like a concrete arch. So when we were first selected for this project in 2008, yes, 2008, this was the condition of the bridge. So much of what had been added, the concrete overhangs and sidewalks and the shotcrete over the surface of the bridge, was in very bad condition, as was some of the masonry underneath. So this is one of my favorite pictures of the condition, and you can see that the barrier is being blocked up off the telephone pole with a block of wood. So that's the condition that the bridge was in 2008. One thing I'll note here, these utility lines that are attached to the bridge were wrapped in asbestos. So that became an issue along this process. So this is a timeline, and I don't expect you to read all this, but you may ask, why did it take 16 years for this project to get done? Well, when we first got the project in 2008, I had visions of celebrating the 200th anniversary birthday of the bridge in 2017 with it all being completed. But unfortunately, there were a lot of things that went on, and I'll just mention a couple of those. We initially had a slow start on the project. Even after being selected, it didn't really get started for a while. There was a lack of information on the bridge. Obviously, no original design plans. So we had to get a lot of information out there in the field. We had to have those asbestos pipes removed. We had to remove the shotcrete so we could see the condition of the masonry underneath. And we had to do a lot of field testing, drilling cores into the rock to determine the strength. Some other things is just the nature of the historic process and environmental process took years. There were so many stakeholders on this project that it took collaboration on every phase. There were also utility and right-of-way complications that I won't get into, but that delayed the project at times. We ran into the pandemic, which we know delayed a lot of things. And we also ran into the I-70 bridge rehabilitation project. So Route 40 was a detour for that project. And so we couldn't very well close Monument Place Bridge at the same time that they were working on the I-70 bridges. So that sort of explains, to some degree, why it took so long. So just a couple shots here of what some of the field work that was done. You can see here on the left, cores being taken from the masonry, and then those cores were tested to determine all the rock strength parameters. The DOH themselves went out and did a LiDAR scan where they go out and determine exactly where everything is electronically. And this isn't a photo, this is data from that LiDAR scan. And from that, we were able to construct a computer model of the bridge and really identify each individual stone that was on that bridge. So after that was done, we went in and looked at each individual stone in the field and classified each one in terms of their condition, whether they were severely deteriorated, mildly deteriorated, or whether they were pretty much sound. And you can hopefully see here some of these red circles, and you'll note that these were joints in the sidewalk where water could spill through. And the worst deterioration occurred because you have roadway salt and that sort of thing spilling through onto the masonry below. Then we used a software that is from Great Britain to do the analysis. They have a lot of masonry arches there, and they have a software that you can use to analyze the arches, and we did that. We entered all the existing conditions of the different stones and ran the analysis, and what we found was the bridge had adequate strength even for today's modern highway vehicles. So nothing really needed to be done in terms of adding strength to the bridge. One thing we did want to do, though, is minimize the loads on the foundations of this bridge. And so we made the decision to remove the existing fill above the arches, the old dirt and rocks, and replace that with new lightweight reinforced concrete. And that would lower some of the loads on the foundations. So what I'm going to do now is just step through some of the details from our final plans. One thing, and if you remember one of these photos from the pre-rehab condition, the base of the arches were being eroded from the stream itself. That's called scour, and we needed to protect those bases, those foundations. So we designed and put on the plans for new concrete jackets to be installed around the bases of the arches. Now, if you were to cut a section down through the bridge, let's say at this point, this is what it would look like. You'd be driving in and out of the page up here on the roadway, and this is the bottom underside of the arch. This is that portion that we filled with lightweight concrete. You can see it here in blue. Just for information, that lightweight concrete is about 120 pounds a cubic foot, which is about 30 pounds less than normal weight concrete. The next part was actually the deck, and we designed that deck as if it was not supported continuously here underneath, just to be conservative, and we reinforced it with steel reinforcement. So that deck would have adequate strength even if there was some subsidence here underneath. And you can see that the sidewalk was then cast on those cantilevers beyond the sidewalls of the arch. One of the other things we added to the design was really driven by the environmental process and the historic process. They really wanted this bridge to look as similar to the original bridge, at least how the bridge looked after 1930, with the overhangs and the railings And one of the things that we included in the design were these overhang brackets. If you look at a picture of the old bridge, these were brackets that supported that overhanging deck. Well, we didn't need those with our new deck, but they wanted them anyway to mimic the appearance of the bridge before the rehab. The last detail I'll mention is the barrier itself. That was a big consideration, and we needed to provide a crash-worthy barrier for the modern vehicles. So the problem became finding a barrier that resembled the 1930s barrier, but was still crash-worthy. So we hunted all over the place and actually found a standard barrier from the state of Texas that very closely resembled the barrier that had been on the bridge. So that was the barrier that we utilized. We modified it a little bit to get it a little bit closer. And you know how we had mentioned that salt water from the deck might spill out through? Well, that barrier from Texas has openings in it, little windows. And we didn't want that, so we actually cast concrete where those windows were to seal that up and prevent water from spilling down. So in April of 2021, the project was bid, and the winning contractor was Clearwater Construction from Mercer, PA. And the low bid was $3.8 million. And I doubt you can read this, but the top three bids were all within about $100,000, which is good. It shows you have a close, nice, tight set of bids. In the end, with some of the additional work that was added to this project, I'm told that the final contract value came in around $4.7 million after the extras, and that was very close to the engineer's estimate that we had done that was just over $5 million. So there was nothing that was out of the ordinary or unanticipated here on the project. So I'd like to show you now some photos from the construction of the bridge. So the first thing that the contractor wanted to do was work in the dry. He didn't want to have to work, with the stream flowing. So he constructed cofferdams around and diverted the channel around his work zone so that he was able to work. So you remember I said that we had to construct those concrete jackets around the bases of the arch. This is some of that work being done. And you can see that there was reinforcement placed here. It was formed up, and the concrete was poured down below grade. And when it was all said and done, I think the contractor really did an excellent job with this. He even took it upon himself to form one of the rounded ends here that we didn't expect. So you could tell that he really cared about how this looked when the project was over. One thing I'll mention is the removal of that shotcrete became a lot more difficult than what anybody anticipated, because we hadn't been aware that there was so much reinforcement, steel reinforcement in that shotcrete. The other thing was we didn't want to damage the stones that were underneath. So it took a lot of handwork for a long time to get all that taken off. You can see workers here using hand tools to remove that. So once all the shotcrete was off, we assessed the stone, and frankly, a lot of the stones were much smaller than we had anticipated underneath that shotcrete. So it took tons of time and effort and craftsmanship to repair the stones that were damaged, and also to repoint around each and every stone with new grout. It took a long time, and when I had visited the site while they were doing this, there were some craftsmen from Eastern Europe that they had working on this, that had been masons there. And they spent a long time doing all this handwork. But I think it really turned out well. So after that work was done, I mentioned that we had removed all the dirt and rocks and fill that had been above the arches. And these are just some shots of what it looked like with all of that taken off. And you can see the rough top of the old arches and the workers working in here placing steel reinforcement for the new lightweight concrete fill. After that was placed, there was reinforcement placed, steel reinforcement placed, and the deck was formed, and the sidewalks were formed, and that was poured. And then the barriers, they came along. It was very interesting how they formed those barriers. You can see that they constructed forms with styrofoam inserts and for the windows, and then cast the concrete around those forms. This portion of concrete here in those windows is only a couple of inches thick. And we had talked about those aesthetic overhang brackets. This is what those look like after construction. So those are really serving no structural purpose, but they're there to recreate that appearance of the bridge before the rehab. And finally, I'll just step through some photos of the completed bridge here. Some of these were sent to me from our contractor, Clearwater Construction. I think the appearance is accurate in terms of historically recreating what it looked like before. But again, all the safety considerations were taken into account. We have crash-worthy barriers. Everything's designed, and we believe that that the bridge will last for many years to come. And it was open to traffic in November of last year. And there's a nice quote here from Tracy Brown, who's the West Virginia DOH state bridge engineer. And basically he says that the bridge has been used and crossed by multiple generations over 207 years, including a lot of famous people, including Andrew Jackson and many others. And he believes that the recent renovation will help ensure that this historic bridge will continue to be used by future generations and provide them a direct connection to a special piece of West Virginia's infrastructure that's been around since the infancy of our country. So before I move on, we've got a couple minutes. Are there any questions about Monument Place that I could answer here in the middle? Yes, sir. Our estimate, because in the environmental process, you have to do a no-build and a complete replacement alternate. And if I remember right, that cost was actually more than the renovation. It was in the $5 to $6 million range. So it wasn't, this rehabilitation was not to be considered non-cost effective. The question was, with recent flooding, how did the bridge come through? I haven't been made aware of any issues with this bridge. I'm sure that District 6 of the DOH had done their inspections after all of that was done, or after all that flooding had occurred. And if there had been anything in terms of scour or anything like that, I'm sure we'd have probably heard about it. Okay. Go ahead. The question is the configuration of the bridge with the three arches, was that unusual at the time? I don't believe that it was. However, the shape of those arches was unique. They're elliptical shaped, which is unusual. Most arches you'll see are parabolic shaped, and this elliptical shape was something that was a little more unique. I saw. You. Thank you. And yeah, projects like this, I never realized, I had hair when we won this project. So I never thought that it would take as long as it did. But everybody was interested in preserving this the right way. And you're talking about, the State Historic Preservation Office, the FHWA, the West Virginia DOH. There were so many stakeholders in this project, and it was, sometimes decision by committee takes a lot longer than if you just made a decision. So, all right, well, I'm going to move forward to the second part of our discussion about the Wheeling Suspension Bridge rehab that was done. So again, just a brief outline. I'll talk about the history of the bridge, the scope of the rehabilitation, some of the unforeseen issues that came about throughout this project, and then some of the specific structural repairs that were done during that rehab. One thing, someone mentioned to me that they really didn't see much difference in this bridge after the rehab was done. And I'll just say that on these historic projects, sometimes that's a goal, that you don't necessarily see the difference. So the history of the bridge was originally constructed in 1849. Charles Ellett was the designer and contractor on the project. Actually, the cost at the time was $250,000 for both the design and the construction. Just for information, the most recent Ohio River Bridge that we've done here, that the state of West Virginia has done here in was the Wellsburg Bridge, and that cost was $131 million. So prices have gone up a little bit. So the main span of the bridge is just over 1,000 feet. That's the length between the towers. If you go all the way back to where the cables come down in town and over on the island, it's over 1,300 feet long. But when we talk about a main span, we talk about that clear span between the towers over 1,000 feet. And this is the original report that Charles Ellett did over here on the right. And it's hard to see the text. In fact, it disappeared. But at the time, this was the longest clear span in the world, over 1,000 feet. Just for reference, the longest clear span in the world right now is over in Turkey, and it's over 6,600 feet long, which is 1.25 miles. So they've really pushed the limits since this bridge, but this definitely was a record setter when it was first constructed. Ah, there it is. So unfortunately, in 1854, there was a terrific storm. This is a quote from the Wheeling Intelligencer in 1854. And if you want, the library here has reprints of that, all of those articles online. So I'd encourage you to go and read what people had to say about the collapse of the bridge in 1854. Pretty much the whole deck and a lot of the supporting elements collapsed into the river in that terrible storm. We believe it was probably due to to wind, to excitation of the bridge, but it did collapse. And the towers were left. Some of the main suspension cables were left in place. Some had fallen, but could be reinstalled. And that's what was done. In less than 2 months, they opened a 14-foot wide temporary structure. It was a single lane, and it reused much of that, the towers and the main suspension cables. And it wasn't until 1860 that it really took the configuration. They added a lot of different suspender cables and additional strengthening to the bridge. But this bridge has changed over the last 170 years. I had a timeline here of all the different work that had been done on the bridge, but I took it out of the presentation because it was too hard to read. And there was really too many different times that this bridge was worked on and different components were added. So when we were selected for this project, the scope of the work was supposed to be providing new lighting for the bridge, both functional lighting and decorative lighting, to do a full paint job on the bridge, and to do what were really maintenance and preservation type of repairs structurally. Nothing significant in terms of the strength of the bridge, but just repairing things that had deteriorated. So the first thing we had to do were a lot of field inspections. We wanted to get arm's length on every component of the bridge, and that's what we did using whatever means were necessary. You know, we did barge work to get out in the middle of the river. We have a group of free climbers that do rope-assisted climbing to inspect all the cables. And in fact, something that we did that was unusual was we actually, in some locations, unwrapped the main cables because they're wrapped with material around the steel underneath. And we did an inspection, an internal inspection of the main cables. And you can see that those main cables exhibit a significant amount of corrosion. And that corrosion goes as deep as we could see. It's not unsafe in this condition because there hadn't been significant section loss in those individual wires. And in each cable that's about 9 inches in diameter, there are over 2,200 individual wires that make up those 9-inch cables. So that's what you're seeing here, the 2,200 individual wires that make up that main cable, each one of those main cables. So, you know, there was concern that there was corrosion in these main cables, and unfortunately, corrosion like that continues to progress. So talking just for a minute about the lighting, again on this project, there were a lot of stakeholders, obviously, and the appearance of how the bridge, that the bridge would have when lit was a concern for everyone. So we did photorealistic renderings of the bridge at all different times at night to show what the lighting on the bridge would be. So these aren't photographs, these are computer-generated renderings. And just one on the deck. I'd like to know what you folks think about how it looks at night. Good. It took a lot of work, and not from me. The electrical engineers spent a lot of time developing the schemes and determining what fixtures would work and give the appearance that everyone wanted. And, you know, on our design plans, we actually included a lot of the rendering information so that in the field, when they installed them, the fixtures, and tested them, it would give the appearance that everyone had agreed to. So as far as the structural repairs, I mentioned that they were more maintenance and preservation type repairs initially. So things like the bearings underneath the floor system of the bridge needed to be replaced. The steel grid deck had damage and needed to be repaired. There was a significant amount of deterioration of the wood stiffening trusses along the sides of the sidewalk. And each of those components needed to be replaced and replaced in kind with the similar appearance. There was also a lot of wear in different components because you can see over here a lot of things rubbed on each other. And you might think that steel wouldn't deteriorate, but over the years, that rubbing created wear in a lot of these different members. So those needed to be addressed. But I'm going to talk about a couple things that happened that sort of changed the scope of the project. You guys remember this? So I was standing on the beach in Myrtle Beach, and I got a phone call. And it was the district engineer in Moundsville called me and said, "I think we got a problem." He said, "What should we do?" And obviously he knew that folks had to go out and look at the critical components of the bridge and determine if there had been any damage from this. Because the bridge has for years been posted at 2 tons, and the bus weighed about 20 tons, so 10 times the posted limit. Well, luckily, no distress was found in any of the main components. So not long after that, a lot of people asked me, well, if you can drive a 20-ton bus across that bridge, why isn't the weight limit 20 tons? And that reminded me of this. I like Calvin and Hobbes. Reminded me of the Calvin and Hobbes cartoon where the son asked the dad how they know what the load limit on bridges are, and the dad said, well, they drive bigger and bigger trucks over the bridge till it falls down. Then they weigh the last truck and rebuild the bridge. So the point of that is we don't know exactly where that bus was traversing. We don't know what wind was on that structure. We don't know if other vehicles were necessarily on that structure. There are a lot of unknowns. You can't take risks with making an assumption that just because it got across once, that it wasn't going to, that it would be okay to take it across all the time. So in 2017, during one of our inspections, we found a serious issue. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the anchorages. And those sloped anchor houses at each of the 4 corners of the bridge where the cables go down into those? Well, when we were in there, the main suspension cables enter those houses. They are connected to steel anchor rods. Most of those are original. And then those steel anchor rods penetrate the back of that anchor house and are embedded back under Main Street, let's say, on this side. So during the inspection, you can see the condition of some of those anchor rods where they penetrated the back wall of the anchor house. We also found 2 breaks in those anchor rods on one of the main cables that were attached to one of the main cables. So it basically reduced the capacity on that side of the bridge by about 1/6, okay? Because there are two main suspension cables, and they split into 3 groups each when they enter the house. And so there are 6 sub-cables in each of these anchorages, and one of those, the bars that connected one of those, were fractured. Another thing that was found around that same time frame were some deterioration of the stay and sway cables. Now, those are the smaller cables that you see, looks like a nest, okay? They actually had one that snapped. I don't know if you remember that, but the bridge was closed then because that occurred. And it was found that a lot of the other ones were reaching a serious condition like that too. You can see some of those cables. This is one of the stay cables. Stay meaning in the plane of the bridge. Sway cables went off to the side sort of to take wind in that direction. You can see one of these stay cables here just unwrapping. So we knew that something needed to be done and added to the scope of the project. So again, with the deteriorated stay cables and sway cables and the fact that it appeared that at least some of them were reaching their life, the decision was made to replace all of the stay cables and sway cables on the bridge. So that was a big effort. When you go out there and look at all the cabling, not the main cables, but all the other cables on that bridge, and see how many of those there are, and the amount of steel cable that went into that work, it was a lot. And that was a significant part of the cost of this project, was replacing all those cables. Now, one of the things that the contractor had to do was we defined what type and size of cables needed to be replaced out there. We replaced them in kind. So you couldn't really tell the difference that something had been switched out. But we had to unload each of those cables, measure the tension in those cables, put new cables in, and jack them back to that same tension of each cable that was removed on that bridge. And that's sort of this process. And I'll just point out that you can see there was a huge nest of cables. Some of them that were underneath the main suspension cables on the top of the tower, and that created a very difficult situation for the contractor to be able to get to those cables to replace them. So I'll talk about that anchorage problem. This is actually a graphic from Ellett's original design proposal or book. And you can see that the main suspension cables come down into the anchorage house through the back wall, and we don't really know what they do when they get past that. We don't know if they actually built this concept that he had in his book, and without tearing up Main Street and excavating down 30, 40 feet, there was no way to really tell. So with those unknowns, the decision was made to actually come up and design an independent anchorage system for that failed location. One thing I'll note is that while not nearly as bad as this location, there is corrosion in a lot of these other anchorages at all 4 corners of the bridge, varying degrees. In fact, this area has been a problem for a long time. In 1999, they did some repairs at this location, and they lasted for about 25 years. And actually one of the repair anchor bars is one of the ones that failed. So it wasn't just the original anchor bars, it was some of the repair steel that was problematic. So our decision was to create a completely independent anchor system at that location. You can see the procedure here, and I'm going to show you some pictures for each of these stages. But the first thing that had to be done was dismantling of that anchorage house. So all the stonework and everything was identified and set aside so that they could get in and do their work. So after that was deconstructed, the first thing was that we drilled a new steel pile 80 feet down into rock. And that's circled here in red. Then what was done were 200-foot long, high-strength steel tiebacks were drilled into bedrock to resist the pull of the main cables. So this is a photograph of one of the specialty subcontractors or specialty contractors on the job drilling one of those 200-foot long anchors that back into rock under Main Street. So then what we needed to do was get the load out of the main suspension cables and temporarily support it so that we could remove that existing anchorage, those existing anchor bars, and then attach it to the new pile and tiebacks. So we sort of put temporary cables here attached to the main suspension cable and anchored that to the pile temporarily while the connection to the anchors was cut. And that old anchorage was removed. Then that main cable was attached to the new pile and tiebacks, and we released the temporary connection. And the last step was actually reconstructing the anchorage house. And this was another place where I thought the contractor did a fantastic job because some things had changed inside and he had to adjust some dimensions. But I think it really looks exactly like it did before the work. And then post-rehab, this is just some photos. I stopped this morning and tried to get a clearer photo inside the anchorage house to see if we could see the pile back there, but you just can't see it. It's too deep down in there. But you can see that all the other stay and sway cables are all brand new. All the timber work has been repaired, and all the painting has been done. You can see a new stay cable here, and the attachments. You know, we've made sure we've offset those so that there's not wear on any of the components moving forward. And then just some shots of the lighting at night. And that's it. I think we have some time for questions.
Yes, we do. Hi, here I am with the mic. Raise your hand if you have a question.
I'm with Friends of Wheeling, the local historic preservation organization. We're very concerned about the suspension bridge and concerned about whether or not it's going to be reopened to traffic. Do you know anything about that? And then I have a second question if I can keep that.
Yeah. I'm not aware of where that stands at this point. That's obviously with the DOH. I will say that, you know, I've been in discussions, not in the last year, but heard the discussions that have gone on, and the utmost concern is for the safety of the public. You know, you have a 170-year-old resource. It shows its age. You just don't want anything to happen to the public.
Right, and we cannot continue to abuse it and expect it to last.
That's a big point. You know, there was a lot of discussion about, you know, can you control traffic on the bridge and control what goes across that bridge? You know, there were overheight attenuators discussed, things like that, but obviously it didn't stop a 20-ton bus
Right.
from
Yeah.
going across the bridge.
Although the overhead barrier, at least on the Main Street side, is gone. I don't know if you noticed that when you were there today, which is a concern. Well, I'm glad it's gone because it was ugly. Now, it seems to me that I heard historians in the past saying that years ago they periodically oiled the cables, and I'm wondering your thoughts on the wisdom of wrapping them, if that holds more water, and is that worse than unwrapping them and going back to what they did before, oiling them every 6 months or year or whatever?
Yeah, there are certain wraps, different materials that act differently. Neoprene wraps tend to hold water. The wrap that's out there, and I don't remember exactly what it is not as, that does not hold the water as much. Oiling is obviously something that can be done, but there was oil in those cables when we opened them. You could tell that there was still some oil in there. One thing that's done in suspension bridges now a lot to preserve suspension bridges is called dehumidification, and that's been done on some bridges, some larger bridges up in New York and things like that. Very expensive to do. It's a contained system that tends to dry out inside the cables. You're not going to change what's already there. It's an attempt to arrest the progression, but it's extremely expensive to do. That's what I know about preservation. Yes, sir.
Just a comment for the folks here. I'm fascinated by the sway and stay cables, but for the folks here, in the basement of the Capitol Theater, there's a pier where there's a sway cable attached, and the theater was actually built around it in 1925, 26. So that's just an interesting fact in the basement of the theater. The other question I had, though, Matt, you know, there are 3 additional bridge reconstructions in Wheeling that are going to be occurring, and that's the Washington Avenue Bridge very soon, the Schilling Bridge, and the Baker Street Bridge. Are you personally working on any of those, do you know?
We are not.
Okay.
Besides these 2 bridges, we were involved with the I-70 bridge project. We were designers on the new Fulton bridges and the rehabilitation of the bridges on the east side of the tunnel, that interchange 5 there.
Well, thank you. The work that you've done is extremely well done. Thank you.
One thing I'll mention about the anchor for the sway cable, that was another stakeholder because that connection was obviously, because we replaced the stay cables, was part of the work of this project as well, coordinating with Capitol Theater and the folks there.
Any other questions?
So when Jean was talking about, is there a way to keep people from crossing the bridge? There used to be a toll to go across the bridge back in the day. I mean, it was just a few cents, 10 cents, 15 cents, that sort of thing. And so maybe we need to install a toll booth to discourage and to encourage the weight limit. Just as a thought. But at the Wheeling Island end of the bridge, there is a place where you can go inside of, it looks like there's a place to climb inside. Is that? It's on the far end, on the, let's see, it would be the south side. Or maybe it's to fix the lights or to climb up it and do the lights or,
I have to say I'm not aware of what that is, but it may very well be a utility vault
okay,
over
maybe
there.
that's what it is.
For electrical or some other utility. I'd have to go back and look at the plans.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you so much for being so informative and explaining this in a way that we all as laymen and laywomen could understand.
Thank you.
I'd like to know, was that bus company fined heavily for what they did to the bridge or what they could have done to the bridge? Is there anything done with that?
I'm not aware of the outcome of that. I would assume that something was done as far as their insurance, but I don't know that.
What a travesty. It's like terrible, terrible.
I noticed that the rehabilitation did not include repair of the damage that's visible from the 1854 storm damage. So at the top of the tower, the piece of masonry is still missing. So was that a conscious decision to leave it off, or is it too difficult to try to do any kind of repair that would
Both.
fit the
Both.
the
I
aesthetic of
actually
the
had a
bridge?
picture of that in this presentation, but it got cut. Yeah, it really doesn't affect the performance, and it's been there for, almost the entire life, so nothing was done about that. One thing we did do was replace the missing globe on the top of the tower over on that side.
Second question for both bridges. Was any kind of bridge health monitoring system installed on them, as West Virginia DOH just did at the bridge down in Huntington?
It was not.
Maybe time for one more question. Anyone? I see you.
When I drive from Ohio to come to Wheeling, I always go past the bridge. And there are times when I think I'd like to get my power washer out and scrub that stone up there on that archway. And I just wonder, is that not feasible to clean it? Will it make it weak or what? And I just think it just looks so dirty to me. The bridge is so beautiful. And
I guess that's in the eye of the beholder. I sort of like
well, yes.
the way it looks, but that we talked about whether or not in early stages of the project, whether or not that masonry should be cleaned, and the decision was made not to change it.
One more question.
One big problem seemed to be that GPS took people across the bridge. Is there no way to change GPS if it is opened again? I mean, how can we? Well,
That is not something that I know anything about.
not in your wheelhouse.
It is not.
Okay, I'm afraid that's all the time we have today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, folks.